May I present my opening argument, Your Honor?
You may.
Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that on May 1st, 2017, the defendant received a blessing. Born to him and his living girlfriend, Cheyanne Harris, was a son. They named that son Sterling Koehn. That child, Sterling Koehn, was born on May 1st, 2017. And this is a photograph taken of him on July 15, 2017.
Mr. Coleman, which exhibit is that?
Exhibit
Mr.
90.
McAllister, I'm sorry.
This is Exhibit 96, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant and his living girlfriend welcomed this child to their home. They lived in a small town in Chickasaw County, Iowa, a town of about 400 people. The town was Alta Vista. They lived in an apartment. That apartment had 2 rooms, 2 bedrooms. It had a living room, it had a kitchen, and it had a bathroom. You're going to hear from this child's maternal grandmother, Randy Harris, who took this picture. She will tell you that through that summer, she watched Sterling from time to time on the weekends. Sterling was healthy, he ate properly, she cared for him. She loved little Sterling, like the grandchild that he was. He was beginning to smile. That grandmother, Randy Harris, will testify the last time she saw little Sterling alive was on August 5th, 2017, where they went to a little town festival called Wapsie Days, a little community in northeast Iowa. Ladies and gentlemen, when the defendant was granted the blessing of that child, he was also granted a responsibility. Sterling, little Sterling, was as vulnerable as only an infant could be. He was completely dependent on everybody in his life that cared for him. The defendant, his father, and the other caretakers. Little Sterling couldn't feed himself. He couldn't change his diaper. He couldn't regulate his temperature if he was cold or hot. He couldn't put clean clothes on. He couldn't make sure that he was safe. If he needed medical attention, he got it. He was vulnerable as only an infant can be. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that this defendant, this father, whose responsibility it was to care for little Sterling, failed in his responsibilities. He failed. The evidence in this case will show by his actions, he directly caused Sterling's death. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is going to show that little Sterling was placed in a swing in an unheated, stuffy, hot room in that apartment. That he was left in the same diaper for at least 9, maybe 14 days. He was left in that diaper full of stool, such that it attracted bugs, flies that laid their eggs in that diaper, which eggs hatched into maggots while Sterling was alive. And those maggots were in his clothes and in his diaper, feeding on the feces in his diaper. And he laid in that room, in that diaper, between 9 and 14 days. And the evidence will show that that stool in his diaper irritated his skin, such that it ruptured the skin and his bodily fluids came out. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case is going to show that Sterling died of malnutrition. He was under 7 pounds at almost 40 months of age, on the 5th percentile in the Grower chart. He died of dehydration because he wasn't fed, and he didn't get water or hydration through milk, and because of his injuries. And ladies and gentlemen, he died of diaper rash. That's right, diaper rash. The evidence is going to show that that feces he sat in that diaper ate through his skin, allowing E. coli bacteria that was in his diaper and in the stool to enter his bloodstream and cause an infection. Malnutrition, dehydration, infection caused by diaper rash. That's what caused this child's death. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that this defendant, the father of that child, is responsible for that death. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that on August 30th, 2017, this defendant called 911. He called 911 at about 12:55 in the afternoon. And he told the 911 dispatcher that his son had died. He told the dispatcher that his son had died of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. But ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show that that's not what happened in this case. This was not an accident. That was a cover story concocted by this defendant to cover the awful truth. The evidence in this case will show that this was a homicide, that this was murder in the first degree. And this defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree. Now, at the conclusion of this case, the judge will tell you the law. And this is not the time and place to talk about the law. The judge will give you that law at the end of this case. But murder involving felonious child endangerment of a child under certain circumstances is murder under our law. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the judge will talk about that at the end of the case, and you'll have kind of a law to apply to the facts of this case. As you listen to the facts of the case, I want to kind of lay out what happened in this case. What's the evidence going to show? You're going to hear from the first responders that responded in response to the defendant's 911 call. He called about 12:55, and you're going to hear from Tony Friedrich. She is a first responder that lived in the same community within a few miles of the apartment. She's going to tell you that when she got her page, immediately went there, immediately drove there. And while she was driving there, she knew it was an infant in distress, and she was thinking CPR, and she was getting ready to perform CPR. And as she drove to that residence, she couldn't find her. She was confused, and she saw a mail carrier, Tina Shatek. And you're going to hear Tina Shatek testify as well. And she directed her to the residence. And you're going to hear that first responder, that Tony Friedrich, testify. When she got there, she saw the defendant standing outside. And she asked, "Where's the baby?" And she'll describe his appearance, his emotional state, and he led her into the apartment and brought her into that back bedroom. And you're going to hear that first responder testify that she said, "We need light in here because it was dark." And the defendant flipped on the light and he left. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear that first responder describe what she found in that room. She found the child, Sterling, in a swing. One of those swings you have for babies that go back and forth. You can turn it on. You probably have all seen those or had them in your own house. And he was faced, as you walked in the room, the back wall was there. He was directly facing the wall. Not the doorway, not the room, facing the wall. The room was hot and stuffy. This was in August. There was no air movement in the room. There was a blanket on the wall covering the window. It was dark. It was dark. And she'll testify about what she smelled. How she smelled urine and dirty diapers. And she'll testify that she reached for Sterling's arm to try to take his pulse. And his little fists were clenched like this. And they were rigid. And she'll testify about what that means. She'll testify he was cold. She'll testify that he had clothing that had dried blood on it. He had dried blood on his mouth. She'll testify that when she moved the little blanket on top of him, she saw bugs. She saw insects flying. You're also going to hear from Deputy Jason Russell. He was the first deputy that arrived to go into that room. He will also testify because he photographed to document that apartment what he found. He'll testify that he felt little Sterling's clothing, and it was wet. It soaked with urine. He observed Sterling sitting in that little swing and had a cloth cover. It was one just like Deputy Russell had at home. And you could see a stained outline in the cover from the bodily fluids and the diaper contents that had run off of Sterling's body. He'll testify that he also saw those flies. Ladies and gentlemen, at that time, little Sterling's body was a crime scene. And you're going to hear that they took little Sterling's body down to Ankeny, Iowa, near Des Moines, to do an autopsy. You're going to hear in this case from Dr. Dennis Klein, who's the Iowa State Medical Examiner. His job as a pathologist is to do autopsies on people that die, like Sterling. And he performed an autopsy on Sterling Cheyanne. Dr. Klein will tell you that there's two purposes of an autopsy. One is to find the cause of death, and two is to find the manner of death. Dr. Klein is going to testify that he found that Sterling was malnourished, and he'll explain how he did that through an examination of his body, that he had grown very little. His weight at the time of his death was not much more than the weight at the time of his birth, nearly 4 months before. He was malnourished. He'll talk about how dehydration affected his body. And he'll also talk about how that E. coli got into his bloodstream and caused an infection. Ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to hear from Dr. Klein talking about how that infection, how that diaper rash and that resulting infection, how that dehydration would have manifested. What kind of symptoms would Sterling have been looking at exhibiting because of his medical condition? Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Klein is going to testify, and you're going to hear it from this witness stand, that it would have been obvious to anybody that Sterling was not right, that he had a medical condition. He would have been lethargic. He may have had diarrhea or vomiting. He was not a normal, healthy child. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear Dr. Klein testify that the cause of death was denial of critical care, that little Sterling was dependent on the care of his caretakers, and they denied him that care, resulting in malnourishment, dehydration, and that diaper rash resulting in that infection. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll also hear from Dr. Klein that the manner of death was homicide. You're also going to hear from Dr. Klein that he photographed the autopsy, and you're going to have to see some of those photographs. He also collected some entomology evidence. And what entomology is the study of insects. He collected some entomology evidence, bug evidence, insect evidence, and he sent it to an expert. You're going to hear from that expert. His name is Tim Huntington. He is a forensic entomologist. He's board certified. And what that means is that he looks at insect evidence from crime scenes and he uses that to date certain things. And you're going to hear from Dr. Tim Huntington, who's a professor of entomology in a college in Nebraska. You're going to hear him testify that the life of a scuttlefly, those are little flies in your house that look almost like fruit flies. You may see them in your house flying around. They're very tiny, almost like gnats. They have a well-studied life cycle. And you're going to hear Dr. Huntington explain when flies, these type of flies, when they're ready to lay eggs, they find a food source. In this case, that was the diaper and the bodily fluids running off of the skin of little Sterling. And they laid their eggs in these scuttleflies in that diaper. And those eggs hatch into maggots, which then feed on the diaper and its contents. And eventually those little maggots, they come into like a cocoon, almost like a butterfly, before they emerge as flies. And you'll hear Dr. Huntington, the board-certified entomologist, explain that based on his review of the information, the diaper and its contents had been on Sterling for at least 9 and for as many as 14 days. Ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to hear from Special Agent John Turbin, who's an investigator with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. He was called to assist and work hand in hand with the Chickasaw County deputy sheriff that were involved in this case. He conducted on August 30th an interview of Mr. King. And he basically had him go through his day prior to that. And you're going to hear that the defendant told Special Agent Turbin that the day before, this happened on Wednesday, the Tuesday before, he got up at about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and he spent his day with his family. He spent his day with his family. And you're also going to hear in this case, ladies and gentlemen, that there's a 2-year-old child living in that apartment. The defendant's daughter with Cheyanne. He said he spent that day with Cheyanne and the family, including Sterling. And I want to talk about Nala for a minute. That's her name. She was almost 2 years old. When deputies arrived and first responders arrived, they saw Nala. And they noted the contrast between her and little Sterling. Sterling was dead, laying in soiled clothing, not fed, not hydrated. Nala was properly clothed. She was healthy. She had been fed. She wasn't wet. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case, the evidence will show, we hear about a young, inexperienced parent or someone who did not know how to care for children. Nala was properly cared for. But going back to that Tuesday, you're going to hear that the defendant claimed to have played with Sterling that day. They had gone into that swing and played with him. You're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that he said that Sterling was a healthy baby, that there was nothing wrong with him. And when he played with him, he appeared to be alert and happy. Ladies and gentlemen, part of your duty in this case is going to be to decide credibility. Decide credibility. You're also going to hear a few days later, the defendant was interviewed by Sheila Schroeder, an investigator with the Iowa Department of Human Services. When he was interviewed by Special Agent Turbin on August the 30th, the defendant denied anybody in that home was using drugs. When he was interviewed a few days later by Sheila Schroeder, he told her, in contrast, that he had provided drugs to Cheyanne, Sterling's mother, Nala's mother, and he used methamphetamines 2 times a week. You're also going to hear from the defendant's friend, Jordan Clark, who worked with the defendant. You're going to hear him explain that he had been to that apartment on a couple occasions, and he worked with the defendant for a few months, saw him a couple times a week. And he, Jordan Clark, the defendant's friend, did not even know they had a baby. And when he went to that apartment where he used drugs with the defendant, that back bedroom door was closed, and he did not even know that they had a baby. Ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to hear that this isn't a case where the defendant didn't have resources to properly care for the child. You're going to hear that the defendant started the job on May 15th or 16th, 2017, a few weeks after the birth of Sterling. He worked for a trucking company. Nugent's Nuggets was a trucking company in Charles City, Iowa, a short distance from where the defendant lived. And what the defendant did is he hauled broilers or chickens from farms located in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota to the Simply Essentials chicken slaughter plant in Charles City. So what the defendant would do is he would go to Charles City from his home to the Simply Essentials plant, pick up his truck, drive a few hours, pick up the chickens, drive back to the plant and leave them there. He worked in the overnight hours. He typically go into work in the after supper or supper time, 5, 6, or maybe even later, and he'd get done in the early morning hours. You're going to hear that the defendant earned $45,000 a year was his salary, that he was offered health insurance. You're not going to hear this is a case where the defendant didn't have ample resources to care for the child. Ladies and gentlemen, this case at its heart is about actions and consequences. Actions and consequences. It's about the defendant's actions and what he did to little Sterling. Ladies and gentlemen, the consequences of his actions were that Sterling lost his life. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show in this case that the consequences of his actions are that the defendant is guilty of both charges, murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death. Thank you.
Hey guys, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mind Squash. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, a tragedy, not a crime, is what we expect the evidence will show. My name is Les Blair, and along with my colleague, Stephen Drahosel, we represent Zachary Koehn, the defendant in this matter. I'm going to keep this short. As you already heard, this case is about the death of a child. Nothing anybody says throughout this trial is going to soften that. It's a terrible thing. The problem is, of course, that a tragedy like this creates a gut reaction in us. We want to punish them. There's an automatic tendency to what we refer to as rush to judgment. As jurors, it is your responsibility, it is your job not to do that. Now, I'm not going to talk about each individual witness and what each individual witness is going to say. I simply want to point out to you that the state gets to go first. They present their entire case. The defense doesn't get to present our evidence until after the state is done. Because of that, you need to make sure that you keep an open mind, that you listen to all the evidence, and that you don't draw any conclusions or reach any conclusions until after you've heard everything. Because there's going to be a lot here. Now, when all the evidence by both sides has been presented, Mr. Drahosel is going to get back up in front of you, and he's going to talk about the evidence. Why this is a tragedy, but not a crime. And we're going to ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.